Alright everyone, settle in for tonight's exploration. We're veering off the well-trodden path of heroic sagas and stepping into something a touch more unvarnished. Prepare for a deep dive not into celebrated triumphs, but into the forgotten toil and the everyday grit of life for those condemned to the sands of the arena in ancient Rome, specifically during the height of the empire around the 1st century AD. That glossy version of history you've seen in movies? Well, the unvarnished truth of a gladiator's existence was often a far cry, and frankly your modern comforts would feel like a distant, unimaginable dream. So find your coziest spot. If you appreciate a journey into the raw, unfiltered past, a like on the video would be fantastic, and do consider subscribing for more of these historical reality checks. As always, I'm curious to know where you're joining us from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and time. It's always a highlight seeing our global community. Okay, perhaps dim those lights, let a soft ambient sound fill the room, and let's embark on tonight's rather sobering journey together. Imagine yourself not as a spectator in the stands, but as one of the figures on the arena floor. It is the 1st century AD, Rome, the heart of a vast empire. You are not here by choice. Most likely you are a prisoner of war, captured in some distant, conquered land, your home and family lost to you forever. Or perhaps you are a condemned criminal, your life forfeit, now offered as entertainment. Maybe you are a debtor, sold into this life to pay off an insurmountable sum. Whatever your path, it has led you to the ludus, the gladiator school, a place that will strip you of your identity and forge you into a weapon. The lanasta, the owner and trainer of gladiators, views you not as a man but as an investment. Your initial assessment is brutal. Are you strong enough, agile enough, ferocious enough to be worth the expense of training and feeding? Many are not. Those deemed too weak or unsuitable face a grim, swift end, often in the school's own practice arena, a bloody audition. You quickly learn that every day is a fight for survival, even before you see the colossal walls of the Colosseum. This is the 1st century AD, Roman Empire, and life is cheap. Your new home is a cramped, squalid cell within the ludus. Privacy is a forgotten concept. You share your meager space with other desperate men, a volatile mix of languages, backgrounds and temperaments. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, fear and unwashed bodies. Disease is rampant. A simple infection, a festering wound from training, could mean a slow, agonizing death, far from the imagined glory of the arena. The sounds are a constant barrage, the clang of weapons, the shouts of trainers, the groans of the injured. Training is relentless, designed to break you and rebuild you into a killing machine. Under the unforgiving eyes of the doctors, former gladiators themselves who survived, you are drilled from dawn till dusk. Weapon practice with heavy, blunted wooden swords, spears and tridents pushes your muscles to their limits. You learn the specific techniques of your assigned gladiator type, the heavily armed murmillo, the net-wielding retiarius, the swift thrax. Every mistake is met with a lash or a beating. This is 1st century AD, Rome. Discipline is pain. The diet is basic and monotonous, designed for bulk rather than pleasure. Barley porridge, beans, and occasionally some tough meat. It is enough to sustain you through the grueling training, but offers little comfort. You dream of the foods of your homeland, a sharp contrast to the tasteless gruel that fills your bowl. Malnutrition is common, sapping your strength, making you more susceptible to illness. You learn to eat what you are given, without complaint, for even this meager sustenance is a privilege not afforded to all in the underbelly of 1st century AD Rome. The bonds you form with your fellow gladiators are complex and fraught. On one hand, these are the only men who understand your plight. There can be a grim camaraderie, a shared understanding of the fate that awaits you all. On the other hand, you know that one day you may be forced to fight them to the death in the arena. Trust is a dangerous luxury. Friendships are often cut short, by injury, by death in training, or by the demands of the games in 1st century AD, Roman society. The constant threat of death hangs over you like a pall. It's not just the arena. Training accidents are frequent and often fatal. A mistimed block, a slip, a moment of inattention can result in a crippling injury or a swift end. The lanasta has little patience for those who cannot recover quickly. You see men carried away never to return, their places quickly filled by new arrivals. The turnover in the ludus is a stark reminder of your own disposability in 1st century AD, Rome. The promise of freedom, the coveted rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing retirement, is a distant, almost mythical dream for most. Only a tiny fraction of gladiators survive enough fights, display enough skill and crowd-pleasing ferocity, to earn their release. For the vast majority, the ludus is a one-way street to the arena, and the arena is a gateway to an early grave. You cling to this sliver of hope, but deep down the odds are crushingly clear, a stark reality of 1st century AD, Roman entertainment. Before your first fight, the fear is a palpable entity, coiling in your gut. You are paraded through the streets of Rome, part of the Pampa, the pre-game procession. The crowds jeer, cheer or stare with a mixture of pity and bloodlust. You are an object of their entertainment, a spectacle. Then the waiting in the antechambers beneath the arena, the sounds of the crowd roaring above, the smell of blood, sand and fear from previous encounters. It is a sensory assault, designed to unnerve you. Stepping out onto the hot sand of the Colosseum for the first time is a disorienting experience. The sheer scale of the amphitheater, packed with tens of thousands of screaming spectators, is overwhelming. The emperor himself might be in attendance, his thumb holding the power of life or death. The noise is deafening. You try to focus, to remember your training, to control the tremor in your hands. Your opponent, another desperate man, faces you. There is no escape now in this 1st century AD, Roman spectacle. The fight itself is a brutal, exhausting dance of death. The weapons are real, sharp and unforgiving. Every movement is a calculation of risk. A moment's hesitation can be fatal. The sand soaks up the blood, yours or your opponent's. The crowd roars its approval at every skillful thrust, every near miss, every gout of crimson. You are fueled by adrenaline, by fear, by a primal instinct to survive. The roar of the 1st century AD, Roman crowd is a terrifying soundtrack to your struggle. Injury is almost inevitable if you survive more than a few bouts. A gash to the arm, a pierced leg, a blow to the head. The arena physicians, if available, provide rudimentary care, often more concerned with patching you up for the next fight than with your long-term well-being. Infection is a constant danger. Many gladiators die not from a clean kill in the arena, but from a festering wound days or weeks later, alone in their cell in the ludus of 1st century AD. The missio, the decision of whether a defeated gladiator lives or dies, is often in the hands of the crowd or the editor of the games, typically the emperor or a high-ranking magistrate. The wave of handkerchiefs for mercy, the thumbs down for death. Your life hangs on the whim of spectators baying for blood, or swayed by a show of bravery. Imagine the agony of that moment, lying wounded on the sand, looking up for a sign of your fate in 1st century AD. Even if granted missio, your ordeal is far from over. You are dragged from the arena, your wounds tended to as cheaply as possible. The psychological trauma of having killed, or having been at the mercy of the crowd, leaves indelible scars, and you know that soon you will have to do it all again. There is no respite, no peace, only the relentless cycle of training, fear and combat in the gladiator schools of 1st century AD, Rome. The romanticized notion of gladiatorial combat, the noble warriors fighting for honor, is a carefully constructed illusion for the mass. In reality, you are a slave, your life and body owned by your lanasta. Your honor is to die well, to entertain the populace, to serve the political ambitions of those who stage the game. The brutal truth, hidden beneath the spectacle, is one of exploitation and human suffering in 1st century AD, Roman society. Consider the different types of gladiators, each with specialized equipment and fighting styles, often pitted against each other in deliberately mismatched pairings for maximum spectacle. The retiarius with his net and trident, against the secutor, heavily armed and helmeted. These were not fair fights. They were calculated displays of life and death struggle, carefully choreographed to thrill the audiences of 1st century AD, Rome. The odds were often stacked against one or the other from the outset. The cena libera, the last meal often provided to gladiators the night before they fought, is another element often misrepresented. While it might have been a slightly better meal than their usual fare, it was consumed under immense psychological pressure, a feast before potential slaughter. For many it was likely a somber, terrifying affair, each bite a reminder of what might be their final taste of food in 1st century AD, Rome. The sheer scale of the slaughter in the arenas across the Roman Empire is difficult to comprehend. Thousands of men, and sometimes women, perished over the centuries for the entertainment of others, not to mention the countless animals killed in the Venetianes, the wild beast hunts, that often preceded the gladiatorial combat. The sands of the arena were perpetually stained with blood, a testament to the Roman appetite for violent spectacle in the 1st century AD. Gladiators who showed particular skill or bravery might gain a degree of fame, becoming celebrities of a sort. Their images might appear on pottery, or in graffiti. Some wealthy Roman women were known to idolize, and even have liaisons with famous gladiators. But this fame was fleeting and did little to change their fundamental status as slaves or condemned men. Their lives still forfeit at any moment in 1st century AD, Rome. The use of gladiatorial games for political purposes was rampant. Emperors and ambitious politicians sponsored lavish games to curry favor with the populace, to distract them from social problems, and to display their power and generosity. The bread and circuses concept was a cornerstone of Roman social control, and you, the gladiator, are a key component in this machinery of manipulation in 1st century AD, Rome. Your suffering is their political tool. Think about the sounds and smells within the ludus on a daily basis. Beyond the obvious, imagine the constant coughing, a sign of the lung ailments that would have been common in such crowded, unsanitary conditions. The smell of cheap wine, used by some to dull the fear, or the pain. The hushed, desperate prayers, whispered in a dozen different languages. The air itself in 1st century AD, Rome's gladiator schools was thick with misery. The weapons, while real, were also part of the show. Some were designed to inflict spectacular, but not immediately fatal wounds, prolonging the spectacle. The glint of polished bronze and iron under the arena sun, the ornate helmets that obscured facial expressions, transforming men into terrifying archetypes, all contributed to the theatricality of death for the entertainment of 1st century AD, Roman citizens. Escape attempts from a ludus were rare, and almost always doomed to failure. The schools were heavily guarded, often built like fortresses. The punishment for a captured runaway was invariably a particularly gruesome death, perhaps by crucifixion or being thrown to wild animals, as a warning to others. The dream of freedom was powerful, but the reality of recapture was a terrifying deterrent in 1st century AD. The role of the medicus, the doctor or healer within the ludus, was a grim one. Their primary job was not to ensure your long-term health, but to patch you up sufficiently to fight again, to protect the Lenasta's investment. Their knowledge of anatomy was often gained from observing wounds, and their treatments could be agonizing, stitching gaping gashes without anesthetic, setting broken bones crudely. For many in 1st century AD, Rome, their efforts only prolonged suffering. Consider the stark contrast between the public image of Rome, a city of law, order and magnificent architecture, and the brutal reality of life for those at the bottom, like yourself. The Colosseum, a marvel of engineering, was also a temple of death. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was maintained in part by spectacular displays of violence that numbed the populace to cruelty. Your life in 1st century AD, Rome, highlights this grim dichotomy. The few gladiators who did win their freedom, the Rudauri, faced an uncertain future. Some became trainers themselves, their bodies scarred, their minds haunted by their past. Others struggled to integrate into a society that still viewed them with a mixture of awe and contempt. Freedom did not erase the stigma of having been a gladiator, a killer for sport, in the social strata of 1st century AD, Rome. What of the families left behind when you were captured or condemned? You might spend your nights in the ludus, tormented by thoughts of a wife, children or parents you will never see again. This emotional burden, the loss of all personal connections, added another layer of cruelty to your existence. You were in essence already dead to your former life, a ghost in the Roman machine of 1st century AD. The sheer indifference of the crowd to your individual humanity was perhaps the most chilling aspect. To them you were a symbol, a type, a performer in a deadly play. Your pain, your fear, your desperate struggle for life, these were merely elements of the spectacle. They cheered for your death, as readily as they might cheer for your victory, their emotions manipulated by the flow of the combat in 1st century AD. The financial aspect of the games was enormous. Gladiators were valuable commodities. Bets were placed, fortunes won and lost on the outcomes of fights. The Lenasti could become wealthy men, but they also risked financial ruin if their star fighters were killed too soon. You were a pawn in a high-stakes game of profit and loss, your life measured in sesterces. For the entrepreneurs of 1st century AD, Rome, think of the moments of utter despair, alone in your cell after a brutal training session, or a near-fatal the realization that there was likely no escape, no hope of a normal life. The temptation to simply give up, to welcome death, must have been overwhelming at times. Yet the primal instinct to survive, to fight another day,
somehow kept many going, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit even in the face of such horrors in 1st century AD, Rome. The hierarchy within the ludus itself was a microcosm of Roman society. Veteran gladiators, the survivors, held a certain status, often bullying and intimidating new recruits. Favoritism from the doctors or the lanasta could mean slightly better treatment, or a more advantageous pairing in the arena. Corruption and brutality were ingrained in the system, from top to bottom, a reflection of the power dynamics of 1st century AD, Rome. The concept of a good death was something instilled by the trainer. If defeated, you were expected to meet your end with courage, without begging or crying out. This stoicism was part of the performance, part of what the crowd expected, but it was a manufactured bravery, born of desperation and the knowledge that a cowardly death might bring further disgrace, or even torture before the end in the arenas of 1st century AD, Rome. The disposal of the bodies of slain gladiators was unceremonious. Attendants dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, or Mercury, would often prod the fallen to ensure they were dead. Then, the corpses were dragged out through the Porta Libitunensis, the gate of death, to be unceremoniously disposed of, often in mass grave. There was little dignity afforded to those who fell in the service of Roman entertainment. In the 1st century AD, the sheer noise of the arena must have been overwhelming, not just the roar of the crowd, but the blare of trumpets, the clash of weapons, the screams of the wounded and dying. It was a cacophony designed to excite and overwhelm the senses, to draw the spectators into the frenzy of the spectacle. For you on the sand, it was the soundtrack of your potential demise in 1st century AD, Rome. Imagine the dust and heat of a summer's day, in the Colosseum. The sun beating down relentlessly, the sand kicked up by the fighting, sticking to your sweat-soaked skin, getting into your eyes and wounds, the air thick with a metallic tang of blood and the stench of unwashed bodies. These physical discomforts added to the misery of your fight for survival in 1st century AD, Rome. The psychological manipulation was constant. You were stripped of your name, given a new fighting name. You were trained to view your opponents not as fellow human beings, but as obstacles to be overcome, or as threats to your own life. Dehumanization was a key part of the process, both for you and for the spectators, making the killing more palatable in 1st century AD, Roman culture. The brief moments of respite, if any, were precious. A cool drink of water after training, a moment of quiet if the ludus ever stilled. These were fleeting, and served only to highlight the surrounding brutality. You learned to cherish such small things, as they were the only comfort in a life otherwise defined by hardship and the constant shadow of death in 1st century AD. Consider the absurdity of fighting for the entertainment of people who considered you less than human, yet hung on your every move. The irony of your skill and bravery being celebrated by those who would condemn you to death, without a second thought. This paradox was at the heart of the gladiatorial games, a reflection of the complex and often cruel nature of Roman society in the 1st century AD. The economic engine driving the games was vast. It wasn't just the lanasti, it involved animal trappers across the empire, weaponsmiths, armorers, merchants selling food and wine to the spectators, and countless others. The games were a significant industry, and your life, your potential death, fueled this massive enterprise in 1st century AD, Rome. You were in effect raw material for a brutal business. The clothing and armor, while appearing formidable, often offered selective protection, designed more for show than for true safety. Helmets with limited visibility, armor that left vulnerable points exposed, all to ensure the fights were bloody and exciting. Your gear was part of your costume in the deadly theater of 1st century AD, Rome, not a guarantee of your survival. The isolation from the outside world was profound. Confined to the ludus or the arena, your knowledge of events in the city or the wider empire was minimal, filtered through guards or trainers. You lived in a violent bubble, your entire existence revolving around training and combat. This detachment made any hope of rejoining normal society, even if you were freed, incredibly difficult in 1st century AD, Rome. The concept of infamia, or social disgrace, was attached to gladiators, even those who became famous. Despite any popular adulation, you were still on the lowest rungs of Roman society, legally and socially. This inherent dishonor, regardless of your performance in the arena, was a constant reminder of your debased status in 1st century AD, Rome. You were simultaneously celebrated and despised. Think of the sheer number of arenas scattered throughout the Roman Empire, from Britain to Syria. This was not just a Roman phenomenon, but an imperial one, a standardized form of entertainment and social control, exported to the provinces. The demand for gladiators was constant, a relentless machine consuming lives for the amusement of millions across 1st century AD. Europe and beyond. The mental fortitude required to step into the arena time and time again, knowing the risks, is hard to fathom. Was it courage, desperation, or a kind of fatalistic resignation? Probably a mixture of all three. You had to find some inner strength to face the prospect of a violent death each time the gates opened. A daily battle of will in 1st century AD. The contrast between the elaborate public spectacles and the private suffering of individuals like yourself is stark. The Roman world was one of grand monuments and brutal realities, of sophisticated law and barbaric entertainment. Your life as a gladiator epitomized this contradiction, a footnote of suffering in the grand narrative of imperial power, written in 1st century AD, Rome. The end, when it came for most, was bloody and public. Whether by a swift sword thrust or a prolonged agonizing defeat, your death was a spectacle. The crowd would roar, the victor would be hailed, and your body would be unceremoniously removed. Another nameless casualty in the endless games of 1st century AD, Rome. Your only legacy, the fleeting entertainment you provided. The rare gladiator who survived to old age, perhaps as a trainer, would carry the physical and mental scars for life. Haunted by the faces of those they had killed, by the cheers of the bloodthirsty crowds, by the constant proximity to death. There was no true peace for a retired gladiator. In the world of 1st century AD, Rome, only a life lived in the shadow of the arena. As the sun finally sets on your imagined day in 1st century AD, Rome, or rather, on the life of a gladiator, the overwhelming feeling is one of profound waste. The waste of life, of potential, of humanity, all sacrificed on the altar of entertainment and political expediency. The cheering crowds are long gone, but the echoes of that brutality, the truth behind the myth, remain. So as you drift off tonight, perhaps consider the immense chasm between the romanticized images of history and the often harsh, unforgiving realities faced by those who lived. The gladiator, often portrayed as a hero, was more often a victim, a pawn in a game far larger and more brutal than any single combat. A sobering thought indeed. As you seek the solace of sleep, remember that the comforts you enjoy are a world away from the daily struggle for survival that defined so many lives in the past. Let that gratitude bring you a measure of peace.
On the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, between the great rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, where civilizations had risen and fallen since the dawn of history, a new city was born in the year 7062. It was to be a city built not just of mud, brick and stone, but of ambition and ideas. The Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mansur, surveying the landscape, planned his new capital with the precision of an astronomer and the vision of an empire builder. He called it Medinat al-Salam, the city of peace. The world would come to know it as Baghdad. From its perfect circular walls, this city would grow to become the dazzling heart of the Islamic world, a vibrant nexus of commerce, culture, and for several extraordinary centuries, the undisputed intellectual center of the planet. At the core of this golden age lay a remarkable institution, the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, a beacon of learning that not only preserved the priceless knowledge of antiquity, but also ignited a new flame of scientific and philosophical inquiry. The rise of Baghdad represented a seismic shift in the Islamic world. The Abbasid dynasty had seized power from the Umayyads in a bloody revolution, moving the capital from Damascus to this new city in Mesopotamia, a region with deep Persian cultural roots. The Abbasid caliphs, unlike their predecessors, embraced a more cosmopolitan and intellectually curious vision for their empire. They sought to legitimize their rule and display their splendor not just through military might, but through the patronage of arts, sciences, and scholarship. They understood that knowledge was power, and they set out to gather it from every corner of their vast and diverse empire, and beyond. The genesis of the House of Wisdom was modest. It likely began under the reign of the legendary Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the contemporary of Charlemagne, as a palace library and scriptorium, a place for collecting and preserving important manuscripts, particularly those from Persia. But it was under his son, the Caliph al-Mamun, a ruler with a profound personal passion for philosophy and science, that the House of Wisdom blossomed into a formal, state-sponsored academy. It became the nerve center of one of the most significant intellectual undertakings in history, the Great Translation Movement. For centuries, a monumental, systematic effort was undertaken to acquire and translate the great works of science, medicine, and philosophy from other civilizations into Arabic. The caliphs and wealthy patrons dispatched agents to the far reaches of the known world, particularly to the Byzantine Empire,
to purchase or borrow precious Greek manuscripts. They sought the works of Aristotle and Plato, the medical treatises of Hippocrates and Galen, the mathematical writings of Euclid and Archimedes, and the astronomical compendium of Ptolemy. They also sought out philosophical and scientific texts from Persia, written in Pahlavi, and from India, written in Sanskrit, acquiring knowledge of their mathematics, astronomy and folklore. This immense body of knowledge, written in a multitude of languages, needed skilled translators to unlock its secrets for the Arabic-speaking world. The House of Wisdom became a magnet for scholars of all faiths and ethnicity. Muslim, Nestorian Christian, and Jewish intellectuals worked side by side, united by a common passion for knowledge. The Christian scholars were particularly vital to the enterprise. Many of them were fluent in Greek, Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic. They often followed a two-step process. First, translating a Greek text into Syriac, a language with a long tradition of engaging with Hellenistic thought, and then from Syriac into Arabic, ensuring a high degree of accuracy and nuance. Among the most legendary of these translators was Hunayn ibn Ashak, a Nestorian Christian physician and scholar of prodigious talent. He was not just a linguist but a master of the subjects he translated. He led a team of translators and established a rigorous methodology, seeking out multiple manuscripts of a single work to compare them and create the most accurate and authoritative translation possible. He is said to have translated nearly the entire corpus of Galen's medical works, along with writings of Plato, Aristotle and Hippocrates, into clear and elegant Arabic. The work of Hunayn and his contemporaries was not mere mechanical transcription. It was a profound act of cultural transmission, ensuring that the intellectual heritage of the ancient world was not lost, but preserved and made available for a new generation of thinkers. The House of Wisdom was far more than just a translation center. It was a vibrant academy where this newly acquired knowledge was studied, debated, synthesized, and crucially, built upon. The influx of Greek rationalism, Persian literary traditions, and Indian mathematical concepts created an extraordinary intellectual ferment, leading to groundbreaking innovations in nearly every field of human inquiry. In mathematics, the scholars of Baghdad made revolutionary advances. One of the most prominent figures was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, a Persian scholar who worked at the House of Wisdom in the early 9th century. Drawing upon Indian and Greek sources, he wrote a landmark book on calculation using the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, which was instrumental in popularizing these numerals, including the concept of zero, throughout the Islamic world and eventually into Europe. The Latinized version of his name, Algorithm P, gave us the word algorithm. In another seminal work, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing, he laid out the first systematic methods for solving linear and quadratic equations. The Arabic title of this book, Al-Jabr, gave the world the word algebra. In philosophy, scholars like Al-Kindi, often called the philosopher of the Arabs, worked to synthesize the rationalism of Greek philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle, with Islamic theology. This project of harmonizing faith and reason would be continued by later intellectual giants of the Islamic world, such as Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, whose philosophical and medical encyclopedias became standard texts for centuries. They did not just preserve Aristotle, they engaged with him, critiqued him, and expanded upon his ideas, creating a rich and sophisticated philosophical tradition. The spirit of inquiry extended to the heaven. Caliph al-Ma'mun established observatories in Baghdad, equipped with sophisticated instruments like astrolabes and quadrants. Astronomers meticulously observed the stars and planets, testing and correcting the data found in Ptolemy's. They refined calculations for the length of the year, the precession of the equinoxes, and created new astronomical tables, or zai, that were far more accurate than any that had come before. Medicine also flourished. The vast body of translated Greek medical knowledge was integrated with Persian and Indian traditions, leading to significant advances. The great physician and polymath al-Razi, or Raziz, who worked in Baghdad's hospitals in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, wrote a comprehensive medical encyclopedia, and was the first to provide a clear clinical differentiation between smallpox and measles. Baghdad saw the establishment of the first true public hospitals, or Bimaristans, which were highly organized institutions, with different wards for different diseases, pharmacies, libraries and medical schools. They provided free care to all, regardless of faith or social standing, and were models of compassionate and scientific medical practice. The Golden Age of Baghdad was a time of immense cultural and material prosperity. The city itself was a marvel of urban planning, with libraries, bookshops, paper mills, hospitals, palaces, and gardens. The development of paper manufacturing, a technology learned from Chinese prisoners of war, was a crucial catalyst, making books far cheaper and more widely available than expensive parchment. A thriving book market developed, and literacy and intellectual pursuits were highly valued. It was a cosmopolitan city, a crossroads on the Silk Road, where goods and ideas from China, India, Africa and Europe converged, creating a vibrant, multicultural society. However, this golden age could not last forever. From the mid-10th century onwards, the political unity of the Abbasid Caliphate began to fray. The caliphs gradually lost effective control over their vast empire, with provincial governors breaking away to form independent dynasties. Political instability and internal conflicts drained the treasury, and the lavish state patronage that had funded the House of Wisdom and its scholars began to decline. The intellectual climate also began to shift. The rise of more conservative religious movements, sometimes suspicious of the rationalist philosophy inherited from the Greeks, created new theological tension. While scholarship continued to flourish in other parts of the Islamic world, such as in Cairo and Cordoba, the singular brilliance of Baghdad began to fade. The final catastrophic blow came in the 13th century. The Mongol Empire, which had erupted out of Central Asia, was expanding relentlessly westward. In 1258, a massive Mongol army, led by Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Chinggis Khan, arrived at the gates of Baghdad. The city, then a shadow of its former glory, but still a great cultural and symbolic center, refused to surrender. After a brief siege, the Mongols stormed the city and unleashed a week of horrific destruction. The population was massacred in vast numbers. Palaces, mosques, hospitals and libraries were plundered and burned to the ground. The destruction of the House of Wisdom and the city's other great libraries was a devastating loss for world civilization. A popular, though possibly apocryphal, legend tells that so many countless thousands of books were thrown into the Tigris River, that the water ran black with the ink from their pages for days. While the scale of this specific event may be exaggerated, it symbolizes the magnitude of the cultural cataclysm. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, including countless original works of philosophy, science and literature produced during the Golden Age, were lost forever. The Mongol sack of 1258 is widely seen as the tragic end of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Golden Age of classical Islamic civilization. Yet, the light of the House of Wisdom was not entirely extinguished. Its legacy proved to be remarkably resilient. The vast body of knowledge that had been translated, synthesized, and advanced in Baghdad, had already spread throughout the Islamic world. And from the 10th century onwards, this knowledge began to flow back into Europe, primarily through two points of contact, Al-Andalus, or Muslim Spain, and Sicily. In cities like Toledo and Palermo, Christian and Jewish scholars worked to translate the great Arabic texts on philosophy, medicine, mathematics and astronomy into Latin. This second great translation movement, from Arabic into Latin, reintroduced Europe to its own classical heritage, which had been largely lost or inaccessible during the early Middle Ages. Europeans rediscovered the full works of Aristotle, not in the original Greek, but through the lens of their Arabic translators and commentators like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd. They learned of the advanced mathematics of Al-Khwarizmi and the sophisticated medicine of Al-Azhar. This influx of knowledge had a transformative effect on European thought. It fueled the rise of the first universities, stimulated the philosophical movement of scholasticism, and provided the crucial intellectual foundations for the scientific and cultural flourishing of the European Renaissance and the subsequent scientific revolution. The story of the House of Wisdom is a powerful testament to the interconnectedness of human civilizations, and the vital importance of cultural transmission. It demonstrates that knowledge is not the exclusive property of any single culture or faith, but a shared human heritage that is passed from hand to hand across the centuries. The scholars of Baghdad, in their wisdom and intellectual curiosity, served as crucial custodians of antiquity's legacy. They did not merely preserve it, they engaged with it, enriched it, and created a vibrant intellectual synthesis that would in turn help to ignite a new era of learning in the West. The fall of Baghdad is a tragic reminder of the fragility of civilization, and the immense loss that can be wrought by violence and intolerance. But the enduring legacy of the House of Wisdom is a more hopeful one, a story of how the quest for knowledge, can transcend cultural and religious boundaries, and how the light of inquiry, once lit, can never be truly and permanently extinguished.
Upon the vast empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a vessel drifts under the equatorial sun, its sails slatting in the light air. For months it has been a world unto itself, a small self-contained wooden island of men, brine, and burning anticipation. The days pass in a slow, monotonous rhythm of watch and work, the sea offering no sign, no promise. Then from the lookout perched high on the mainmast, comes the cry that electrifies every soul on board, the call that awakens the ship from its slumber. There she blows. Instantly the quiet deck erupts into a scene of disciplined chaos. Men rush to their stations, ropes are coiled, and whaleboats, graceful and deadly, are lowered into the water. This is the beginning of the hunt, a brutal, dangerous, and often epic struggle between man and Leviathan, that defined one of the most remarkable industries of the 19th century, the American whale fishery. For over a century these voyages would push the boundaries of exploration, build immense fortunes, light the lamps of the world, and create a unique, enduring chapter in history. The story of American whaling began modestly. The indigenous peoples of North America had long hunted whales close to shore. When European colonists arrived, they learned to do the same, establishing shore whaling operations along the coast of New England. Men would watch from shore-based towers, and upon sighting a whale they would launch small boats to pursue it, tow the carcass back to land, and process the blubber into oil. But the true genesis of the great American whaling industry came in the early 18th century, with the pursuit of a specific, far more valuable and much more dangerous creature, the sperm whale. Unlike other whales, the sperm whale's massive head contained a huge reservoir of a unique waxy liquid, known as spermaceti, which could be refined into the finest, brightest, and most smokeless candles imaginable. Its blubber yielded a high-quality, clean-burning oil, and deep within its intestines, a lucky few might find ambergris, a rare and fabulously valuable substance used as a fixative in luxury perfumes. The pursuit of this creature would lure American ships away from the coast and out into the deep oceans of the world. The island of Nantucket, off the coast of Massachusetts, became the cradle and first great capital of this new deep-sea industry. Its community, dominated by pragmatic and resourceful Quakers, developed the ships, the techniques, and the commercial networks necessary for these long and arduous voyages. A typical whaling voyage was an immense undertaking, a speculative venture that could last for 3, 4, or even 5 years. A whale ship was not merely a vessel, it was a factory at sea designed for endurance and self-sufficiency. These were sturdy, broad-beamed, and heavily built ships, often with reinforced bows for navigating icy waters. Their decks were dominated by a peculiar and essential piece of equipment, the tryworks, a brick furnace containing 2 large iron cauldrons, where the blubber would be rendered into oil. The ship carried a fleet of smaller, lighter whaleboats, the swift and nimble crafts from which the actual hunt was conducted. The hunt itself was an enterprise of extraordinary skill, courage, and peril. It began with the lookout's cry, followed by the frenetic lowering of the whaleboats, each manned by a crew of 6. The officer or mate stood at the stern steering with a long oar, while the boat steer, the harpooner, stood poised in the bow. The crew rowed with all their might, closing the distance to the immense creature. The approach had to be silent and careful, to avoid startling the whale. When the boat was nearly upon the Leviathan, the boat steer would hurl his harpoon, a heavy iron spear with a barbed head attached to a long rope. If the harpoon found its mark, the tranquil sea would erupt in a fury of foam and motion. The wounded whale would often dive deep or surge forward in a desperate attempt to escape. The whale line, coiled carefully in tubs, would fly out of the boat with terrifying speed, smoking from the friction. This was the famous Nantucket sleigh ride, a wild, uncontrolled journey as the small boat was dragged across the ocean at incredible speeds by the powerful, panicked whale. The crew could do nothing but hold on, bail water, and wait for the great creature to tire. This could last for hours and cover many miles, sometimes pulling the boat so far from the mothership that it would be lost at sea. When the whale finally slowed, exhausted from its efforts, the most dangerous part of the hunt began. The crew would pull themselves along the line, drawing the boat up alongside the immense, heaving flank of the whale. Now the officer and the boat steerer would switch places. The officer took up a long, sharp spear known as a lance, and with great precision and courage, would probe for the whale's vital organs, particularly its lungs. The whale would thrash in its death throes, or flurry, its massive tail capable of smashing a whaleboat to splinters with a single blow. It was a moment of supreme danger, where a single mistake could mean death for the entire boat crew. Once the whale was dead, the long, dirty work of processing the carcass began. The immense body, often weighing as much as 50 or 60 tons, was towed back to the whale ship. Then began the cutting. The crew, working on precarious wooden platforms,
lowered over the side of the ship, used long-handled spades and cutting tools to peel off the whale's thick layer of blubber in huge strips, a process akin to peeling a gigantic fruit. These massive blanket pieces were hoisted onto the deck, where they were minced into smaller chunks. Now the tryworks were fired up. The minced blubber was thrown into the great iron pots and boiled down, a process known as trying. The ship's deck was transformed into a smoky, greasy and hellish scene. The fires of the tryworks, often fed by the scraps of rendered blubber itself, burned day and night, casting a lurid glow upon the men as they worked, covered from head to toe in oil the rendered oil was cooled and then funneled into large wooden casks, which were stowed below deck. For the sperm whale, the head was brought on board, and the valuable spermaceti was bailed out by the bucketful. This entire process, from a single whale, could take several days of relentless, exhausting labor. By the 1840s, the American whaling industry had reached its golden age. The port of New Bedford, Massachusetts, had surpassed Nantucket as the whaling capital of the world, its waterfront a forest of masts, its warehouses, overflowing with whale oil and bone. It was, for a time, the richest city per capita in the United States. The American whaling fleet, numbering over 700 vessels at its peak, had become a truly global enterprise. These New England ships were a common sight in every ocean of the world. They rounded Cape Horn into the Pacific, which became their primary hunting ground. They sailed to the coasts of Japan, into the Indian Ocean, and eventually pushed into the frigid, dangerous waters of the Arctic and Antarctic, constantly seeking new grounds as whale populations were depleted in the old one. The crews of these whale ships were remarkably diverse, forming a unique global subculture. While many were farm boys from New England seeking adventure or fortune, they were joined by experienced mariners from the Azores and Cape Verde, by Polynesians and other Pacific Islanders, recruited during the long voyages, and by free African Americans, for whom a whale ship was one of the few places where a man could advance based on skill and courage, rather than the color of his skin. It was a hard life of long absences, low pay for the common seaman, and constant danger, but it offered a glimpse of the wider world and a chance, however slim, for social mobility. The products of this arduous industry were vital to the 19th century world. Whale oil was the primary illuminant of the age, lighting the homes, streets, lighthouses and factories of America and Europe. Before the discovery of kerosene, it was the fuel that allowed people to read, work and socialize after dark, extending the productive day. Spermaceti candles, clean burning and bright, were a luxury item that graced the tables of the wealthy. Baleen, the flexible bristle-like plates from the mouths of right whales, was a crucial industrial material, the plastic of its day. It was used for corset stays, umbrella ribs, skirt hoops, carriage springs and countless other items that required flexible strength. The whaling industry did not just provide light, it provided the very structure of 19th century fashion and convenience. However, this great industry, which seemed so dominant and essential, was brought to a swift and dramatic decline by a combination of technological innovation and historical events. The first and most decisive blow came in 1859, with the discovery of petroleum in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Soon, methods were developed to refine crude oil into kerosene, a cheap, abundant and efficient fuel for lamps. Kerosene quickly displaced whale oil as the primary illuminant, and the central economic pillar of the whaling industry crumbled almost overnight. The second blow came with the American Civil War. The whaling fleet, primarily based in the Union States of New England, became a prime target for Confederate commerce raiders. Vessels like the CSS Alabama, and most devastatingly the CSS Shenandoah, roamed the oceans, capturing and burning dozens of American whale ships. The Shenandoah, in a particularly destructive campaign in the Pacific and Arctic, long after the war had officially ended, single-handedly crippled a significant portion of the remaining fleet. After the war, the industry, now a shadow of its former self, made a last desperate push into the Arctic, hunting bowhead whales, primarily for their valuable baleen, which was still in high demand. But this too ended in disaster. In 1871, a fleet of over 30 whale ships operating off the coast of Alaska was trapped by an early and unexpected freeze. The ice closed in, crushing the ships and forcing over 1,200 whalemen to make a harrowing 70-mile journey over the ice and in open boats to reach the few remaining rescue vessels. The disaster was a catastrophic financial loss from which the industry never recovered. Through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American whaling faded into obscurity. Steam-powered ships with explosive harpoon guns replaced the old sailing vessels and whaleboats, but the industry was a niche one, a relic of a bygone era. The age when whale oil lit the world was over. The legacy of the American whaling industry is complex and profound. It was a brutal and exploitative industry, both in its treatment of the whales, which were hunted to the brink of extinction, and often in its treatment of its crew. Yet, it was also an engine of economic growth, a driver of exploration, and a force that projected American influence across the globe. It created a unique and resilient culture in its home ports, and left a deep imprint on American literature, most famously in Herman Melville's timeless epic, Moby Dick, which transformed the gritty reality of a whaling voyage into a profound meditation on obsession, nature, and the human condition. Today, the beautifully preserved historic districts of Nantucket and New Bedford stand as museums to this remarkable era, a time when the pursuit of the ocean's greatest creatures fueled a nation's growth and cast a light that was seen around the world. The story of the whale hunters is a powerful saga of human ambition, of a perilous dance with the sublime power of nature, and a poignant reminder of how even the greatest of industries can be rendered obsolete by the relentless march of human innovation.
In the early 6th century, the city of Constantinople stood as the defiant heir to a fallen empire and the radiant capital of a new one. It was the last great bastion of Roman civilization, the queen of cities, its massive Theodosian walls repelling barbarian hordes, its Golden Horn harbor bustling with the commerce of East and West. Within these walls, a new emperor, a man of humble Balkan peasant stock named Justinian, ascended to the throne in the year 527. He was possessed by a colossal ambition, the renovation imperii, the restoration of the Roman Empire to its former glory. At his side was a woman of equally unlikely origins and even greater steel, his wife and co-ruler, the Empress Theodora. Together, this extraordinary couple would preside over one of the most brilliant and tumultuous eras in Byzantine history, an age of reconquest, legal revolution, architectural marvels, and devastating plague. A final, fervent attempt to reclaim the majesty of Rome. Justinian's rise was a product of patronage and immense personal drive. His uncle, a simple soldier named Justin, had risen through the ranks to become emperor, and he brought his promising nephew to the capital, ensuring he received the finest education. Justinian was diligent, learned, and consumed by a vision of imperial grandeur. Theodora's origins were far more scandalous. She was the daughter of a bear-keeper for the Hippodrome's Green faction, and she spent her youth on the stage as an actress and mime, a profession synonymous in that era with a courtesan's life. She was renowned for her beauty, her intelligence, and her sharp wit. Justinian fell deeply in love with her, and in a move that shocked the rigid Byzantine aristocracy, he had the laws changed to allow a senator to marry a woman from the stage. When he became emperor, he crowned her Augusta, empress, not merely his consort, but his most trusted advisor and in many ways, his partner in rule. Their reign was almost cut short just 5 years after it began, during the terrifying Nika riots. The riots began, as they often did, in the Hippodrome, the great chariot racing stadium that was the heart of the city's popular entertainment and political life. The city's populace was fiercely divided into two factions, the Blues and the Greens, who were part sports fans, part street gangs, and part political interest groups. A dispute over the arrest of members from both factions escalated into a full-blown insurrection against the throne, united under the defiant chant Nika, meaning conquer, or win. The city was engulfed in flames. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the Holy Wisdom, was burned to the ground. Rioters, urged on by disgruntled senators who saw an opportunity to depose the upstart emperor, crowned a new emperor of their own. Justinian and his court were besieged in the great palace, their situation desperate. His generals and advisors urged him to flee, to take to the sea, and save his own life. As the ships were being prepared for escape, Theodora, the former actress who now wore the imperial purple, made her stand. In a moment that would become legendary, she rose before the council and delivered a speech of extraordinary courage. She declared that she would not flee. The throne, she argued, was a noble and fitting place from which to face death, and that the imperial purple made a fine burial shroud. It was better to die an emperor, she insisted, than to live as a fugitive. Her words electrified the council and shamed the wavering men into action. Justinian's resolve was stiffened. He ordered his brilliant general, Belisarius, to take whatever measures were necessary. Belisarius and another general, Mundus, gathered their loyal troops, sealed the exits of the Hippodrome where the rioters were gathered, and carried out a brutal and systematic massacre. Tens of thousands were killed. The rebellion was crushed in a river of blood. Justinian's throne was secure, saved from the brink of collapse by the iron will of his empress. With his power now brutally consolidated at home, Justinian turned his gaze outward, to the lost western provinces of the Roman Empire. He was a Roman emperor in Constantinople, but he dreamed of once again ruling over Rome itself, and of reclaiming North Africa and Italy from the Germanic tribes who had conquered them a century earlier. His instrument for this grand reconquest was Belisarius, a military genius of the First Order. In 53-3, Belisarius launched a swift and brilliantly executed campaign against the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. The Vandalic War was a stunning success, and the province was restored to the empire in a matter of months. The reconquest of Italy from the Ostrogoths, however, proved to be a far more arduous and devastating affair. The Gothic War, which began in 5035, would drag on for nearly 2 decades, ravaging the Italian peninsula. Belisarius led the initial campaigns, capturing Sicily, Naples, and even the city of Rome itself, but the Goths rallied, and the war descended into a long brutal slog of sieges, counter-offensives, and shifting allegiances. The immense cost in treasure and manpower drained the imperial coffers, and Italy, the heartland of the old empire, was left ruined and depopulated by the time it was finally, fully reconquered by another of Justinian's generals, the eunuch Narses. While Justinian had in part realized his dream of restoring the empire's frontiers, it was a victory that came at a ruinous price. Perhaps Justinian's most enduring and influential achievement was not on the battlefield, but in the realm of law. For centuries, Roman law had grown into a vast, chaotic, and often contradictory tangle of imperial statutes, senatorial decrees, judicial opinions, and legal commentaries. It was nearly impossible for even learned jurists to navigate. Justinian, with his passion for order and system, resolved to bring clarity to this chaos. He appointed a commission of eminent jurists, led by the brilliant and tireless Tribonian, to undertake the monumental task of codifying the entirety of Roman law. The result of their labor, produced with remarkable speed, was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This massive work consisted of 4 parts. The first was the Codex Justinionis, a systematic collection of all existing imperial laws, edited to remove contradictions and redundancies. The second, and most intellectually ambitious part, was the Digest, or Pandex, a vast anthology of the writings of the great Roman jurists of the classical era, condensing thousands of legal opinions into a coherent whole. The third part was the Institutes, a textbook for first-year law students, providing a clear and logical introduction to the principles of Roman law. Finally, the Novallae, or New Laws, comprised the legislation passed by Justinian himself during his reign. The Corpus Juris Civilis was a landmark achievement, preserving the rich legal heritage of Rome, and transmitting it to posterity. It would become the foundation for the legal systems of most of modern continental Europe and beyond, its principles still influencing law and governance to this day. In the wake of the Nika riots, which had reduced much of central Constantinople to ashes, Justinian seized the opportunity to rebuild his capital on an even grander scale. His crowning achievement was the reconstruction of the great cathedral, Hagia Sophia. He instructed 2 brilliant architects and mathematicians, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, to create a church of unprecedented size and splendor, a building that would proclaim the glory of God and the power of his empire. The result, completed in the astonishingly short time of just under 6 years, was an architectural marvel that defied the conventions of the age. The defining feature of Hagia Sophia was its immense central dome, over 100 feet in diameter, which appeared not to rest on solid walls, but to float ethereally as if suspended from heaven by a golden chain. This architectural sleight of hand was achieved through the use of a revolutionary structural system of pendentives, triangular segments of a sphere, that mediated the transition from the circular base of the dome to the square bay of the piers below. Light flooded into the interior through a ring of 40 windows at the base of the dome, creating a luminous, seemingly weightless space that was intended to evoke the divine. The interior was lavishly decorated with immense columns of rare marble, precious metals, and later magnificent golden mosaics. Upon its consecration in 57, the historian Procopius wrote of its breathtaking effect, and Justinian himself is said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed." Hagia Sophia would remain the largest cathedral in Christendom for nearly 1,000 years, the ultimate expression of Byzantine architectural genius. But even as Justinian was realizing his dreams of reconquest and rebuilding, a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions was about to befall his empire. In the year 5041, the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague arrived in the empire, likely carried by grain ships from Egypt. The plague of Justinian, as it came to be known, swept through Constantinople and the entire Mediterranean world, with terrifying speed and lethality. The contemporary historian Procopius, who lived through it, left a chilling account of the plague's progress. The sudden fevers, the painful bubonic swellings, the delirium, and the swift death that followed. The pandemic was devastating. At its peak in Constantinople, it was said to be killing 10,000 people a day. The city's administrative functions broke down. There was no one to collect the dead, who were piled in buildings, thrown into the sea, or buried in mass graves. The plague raged for several years, and would recur in waves for the next 2 centuries, ultimately killing an estimated 25 to 50% of the population of the empire. Justinian himself contracted the disease, but miraculously survived. The plague, however, crippled his ambition. It decimated the army, shattered the economy, and made it impossible to effectively govern and hold the newly reconquered Western territories. The dream of a fully restored Roman Empire died with the countless victims of the pandemic. Throughout his long and tumultuous reign, Justinian's most constant and influential partner was Theodora. More than just an empress, she was his co-ruler, his confidant, and his intellectual equal. Her intelligence and political acumen were formidable. It was her courage that saved their throne during the Nika riot. She took an active role in governance, pursuing her own policies, particularly in religious matters, where she often supported the Monophysite Christian faction, a group considered heretical by the official Orthodox Church, that her husband championed. She also enacted laws to protect women, including measures against forced prostitution, and legislation granting women greater rights in divorce and property ownership. Her death from cancer in 5048 was a devastating personal and political blow to Justinian, who mourned her deeply and reigned for nearly 2 more decades without his most trusted partner by his side. Justinian's later years were a struggle to maintain the vast but exhausted empire he had built. He continued to engage in theological debates and building projects, but the grand ambitions of his early reign, curtailed by the plague and the immense cost of his wars, could no longer be sustained. He died in 5065, leaving behind an ambiguous and deeply contested legacy. He had reconquered vast territories, but at a ruinous cost that left the empire financially drained and militarily overstretched. He had created timeless masterpieces of law and architecture that would influence the world for centuries. He had presided over a brilliant golden age of Byzantine culture, yet his reign was also marked by brutal suppression and a devastating pandemic. He was, in a sense, the last of the truly Roman emperors, a ruler whose gaze was fixed on the glorious past, even as he laid the foundations for a new and distinct Byzantine future. His reign was a breathtaking, tragic, and ultimately unsustainable effort to hold back the tide of history, a final, brilliant flash of Roman grandeur before the long medieval twilight.
At the dawn of the 5th century before the Common Era, the world was dominated by the immense power and splendor of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. From its magnificent capitals at Susa and Persepolis, the King of Kings ruled over a vast multicultural domain that stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west. It was an empire of sophisticated administration, vast armies, and a worldview centered on a single divinely ordained monarch, bringing order to the disparate peoples of the earth. On the far western fringe of this great empire lay a scattered collection of small, fractious, and fiercely independent communities, the city-states of the Hellenic world. These Greeks, with their novel ideas of citizenship, spirited debate, and political freedom, were a people of little consequence in the grand scheme of the Persian world. Yet, in a series of dramatic and legendary conflicts, this small collection of city-states would challenge the might of the world's greatest superpower, a clash of civilizations that would not only determine their own fate, but would profoundly shape the future course of Western history. The seeds of the conflict were sown in Ionia, a region of prosperous Greek city-states situated on the Aegean coast of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. These cities had fallen under the relatively light hand of Persian rule, but the spirit of Greek independence chafed under foreign dominion. In 49 BCE, incited by Aristagoras, the ambitious tyrant of Miletus, the Ionian cities rose in a widespread revolt against their Persian overlords. Seeking aid from their brethren across the sea, they found little support, except for a contingent of 20 ships from the rising city of Athens, and 5 from Eretria. This assistance, though militarily limited, was a fateful decision. The rebels, with Athenian support, managed to march inland and burn the Persian regional capital of Sardis. This act of defiance enraged the Persian king, Darius the Great. Though the Ionian revolt was eventually and brutally crushed by 49-4 BCE, Darius would not forget the impudence of the Athenians, who had dared to aid his rebellious subjects. He famously ordered a servant to repeat to him 3 times at every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." 10 years later, in 4090 BCE, Darius's retribution arrived. He dispatched a powerful naval expedition across the Aegean, its purpose not full-scale conquest, but a punitive strike to punish Athens and Eretria. After sacking the city of Eretria, the Persian fleet landed its army of infantry and cavalry on the wide sandy beach of Marathon, about 26 miles northeast of Athens. The Athenians were faced with a terrible choice. Their professional soldiers, the heavily armed citizen hoplites, were badly outnumbered, and their only significant potential ally, the Spartans, were delayed by a religious festival. A debate raged in the Athenian assembly. Should they barricade themselves within their city walls, or march out to meet the invaders on the field of battle? Urged on by the charismatic general Miltiades, the Athenians made the audacious decision to fight. The Athenian army, a force of perhaps 10,000 hoplites, marched to Marathon and took up a defensive position in the hills overlooking the plain where the Persians were camped. For several days the two armies faced each other in a tense standoff. Then, seeing the Persian cavalry temporarily absent from the enemy camp, Miltiades gave the order to attack. The Athenian hoplites, arrayed in their phalanx formation, charged at a run across the plain, a tactic designed to minimize their exposure to the famed Persian archers. They crashed into the Persian lines with immense force. Though the Persian center initially held and pushed back the weaker Athenian center, the strengthened Athenian flanks crushed the Persian wings and then wheeled inwards, enveloping and routing the heart of the Persian army. The defeated Persians fled in panic back to their ships. The Battle of Marathon was a stunning and decisive victory for Athens,
a triumph of tactical brilliance and the discipline of the citizen soldier. It shattered the aura of Persian invincibility and instilled in the Athenians an immense sense of pride and self-confidence. The victory at Marathon provided Athens with a precious decade of respite, but a wise few knew that the Persian threat was far from over. Among them was Themistocles, a brilliant and cunning Athenian statesman. During this interlude, a rich new vein of silver was discovered in the state-owned mines at Laurion. While others advocated for distributing the windfall among the citizens, Themistocles, with great political skill, persuaded the Athenian assembly to invest the entire sum in a project of unprecedented scale, the construction of a fleet of 200 advanced warships, known as triremes. He argued that the true defense of Athens lay not on land, but at sea, interpreting a cryptic prophecy from the oracle at Delphi, that Athens would be saved by its wooden walls. This decision to become a major naval power would prove to be the most consequential in the city's history. In Persia, Darius died, but his son and successor, Xerxes I, inherited his father's desire to punish the Greeks. He resolved to finish the task once and for all, not with a punitive raid, but with a massive, overwhelming invasion designed to absorb all of Greece into his vast empire. His preparations were on a monumental scale. He assembled one of the largest armies the ancient world had ever seen, a multinational force drawn from every corner of the empire. To support this army, he had a massive fleet of over 1,000 ships constructed. In a stunning feat of engineering, he had a canal dug through the Athos Peninsula to avoid the stormy seas that had wrecked a previous Persian fleet, and he had 2 massive pontoon bridges built across the Hellespont, the strait separating Asia from Europe, allowing his army to march directly into Greece. Faced with this existential threat, the normally fractious Greek city-states managed to form a Hellenic League, with Sparta, renowned for its unmatched land army, taking the lead. Their strategy was to use Greece's mountainous terrain to their advantage, choosing narrow passes where the Persians' numerical superiority would be neutralized. The first line of defense was the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae, the Hot Gate. In the summer of 480 BCE, a small Greek force of some 7,000 men, led by the Spartan king Leonidas and his personal bodyguard of 300 elite Spartan warriors, took up a position there to block the Persian advance. For 3 days this small Greek army held off the vast hordes of the Persian army. The narrow pass rendered the Persian numbers meaningless, and the superior discipline and armor of the Greek hoplites inflicted massive casualties on the invaders. Xerxes reportedly leapt from his throne in fury 3 times as he watched his elite troops, including his own royal bodyguards, the Immortals, fail to break the Greek line. The pass, however, was ultimately bypassed. The local Greek trader revealed a hidden mountain path to the Persians, allowing them to encircle the Greek position. When Leonidas learned of the betrayal, he knew the battle was lost. He dismissed the bulk of the allied Greek forces, ordering them to retreat and prepare for future battle. He himself remained at the pass with his 300 Spartans, along with 700 Thespians who courageously chose to stay, and a contingent of Thebans. They were determined to fight to the last man, to delay the Persian advance and to create an immortal legend of heroic sacrifice that would inspire all of Greece. They were annihilated, but their stand at Thermopylae became a timeless symbol of courage against overwhelming odds. While Leonidas fought on land, the Greek fleet, led by Themistocles, engaged the Persian navy in the nearby straits of Artemisium. They fought a series of inconclusive battles, but upon learning of the defeat at Thermopylae, the Greek fleet strategically withdrew southward. The path was now open for Xerxes. His army marched through central Greece, and his forces captured and burned the now evacuated city of Athens. From a high vantage point, Xerxes watched as the temples of the Acropolis, the symbols of Athenian pride, were put to the torch. It seemed that the Persian king had achieved his goal, but Themistocles had one final desperate gamble. The Greek fleet was gathered in the narrow straits of Salamis, near Athens. Many of the allied Greek commanders wanted to retreat to the Isthmus of Corinth to defend the Peloponnese. Themistocles knew that a battle in the open sea against the much larger Persian fleet would be disastrous. He argued passionately that their only hope lay in fighting in the confined waters of the straits, where the Persians' numbers would become a liability, preventing them from bringing their full force to bear. To ensure the battle happened on his terms, he resorted to a masterful piece of deception. He sent a loyal messenger to Xerxes, pretending to be a deserter, with a secret message. The Greek fleet was demoralized and planned to flee during the night. He advised Xerxes to block the exits of the straits immediately to trap and destroy them. Xerxes, confident and eager for a final, decisive victory, fell for the ruse. He ordered his massive fleet to enter the narrow straits to form a blockade. As dawn broke, the Persian fleet found itself crammed into the confined waters, their ships struggling to maneuver. The smaller, more agile Greek triremes, waiting for the opportune moment, then surged forward, ramming and sinking the Persian vessels. The battle descended into a chaotic melee. The Persian ships, unable to form proper lines or retreat, crashed into one another, their crews disoriented. Xerxes, watching from a golden throne set up on a hillside, overlooking the bay, could only look on in horror as his magnificent navy was systematically destroyed. The Battle of Salamis was a stunning and decisive victory for the Greeks, a triumph of strategy and deception over sheer numbers. The naval defeat at Salamis was a turning point. With his sea communications now vulnerable, Xerxes retreated to Asia with a large portion of his army, leaving his general Mardonius with a still formidable force to complete the conquest the following year. In 4079 BCE, the final act of the invasion played out on the plains of Plataea. The largest Greek hoplite army ever assembled, led by the Spartan regent Pausanias, confronted and decisively crushed Mardonius's forces in a long and hard-fought land battle. On or around the same day, the remnants of the Persian fleet were destroyed by another Greek force at the Battle of Mycale. On the Ionian coast, the Persian invasion was over, its great army and navy shattered. The aftermath of the Persian Wars was transformative. The victory, against all odds, secured the independence of the Greek city-states, and fostered a powerful sense of a shared Hellenic identity, forged in the crucible of war. The Ionian Greek cities were liberated from Persian rule. Athens, whose city had been burned but whose navy had saved Greece, emerged as the leading power of the Hellenic world. It organized the Delian League, an alliance of Greek city-states, to continue the war against Persia and to ensure future security. However, Athens gradually transformed this league into its own maritime empire, using its funds to finance the city's golden age, the era of Pericles, the construction of the Parthenon, and the flourishing of democracy, philosophy and drama. The very success born of Greek unity in the Persian Wars would ultimately sow the seeds of future conflict, the devastating Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. The Greco-Persian Wars became a foundational story for Western civilization, famously chronicled by the historian Herodotus. They were framed as a monumental struggle between freedom and despotism, between the small independent citizen soldier and the faceless, enslaved subject of a vast empire. While a simplification, this narrative captured a fundamental truth about the different political worlds that had collided. The unlikely victory of the Greeks ensured the survival of their unique political experiments and intellectual traditions, the very traditions that would form the bedrock of so much of later Western thought. The heroic sacrifice at Thermopylae, and the strategic brilliance at Salamis, echoed down through the centuries, a timeless epic of a people who, when faced with overwhelming odds, chose to fight for their freedom on the rocky shores and narrow seas of their homeland.